Well, January has already disappeared and it's nearly time for the February release of Home Assistant. This month there has been more focus on the automations user interface. You can update your Zigbee devices from within Home Assistant and a lot of new integrations this month as well. As always, this video is based on the beta release and so some things might change between this version and the production release version. In January there were actually 6 minor releases and so we are currently on version 2024.1.6 until the new version for February gets released. So let's see what the Home Assistant team has been up to. Now, the automations engine has come such a long way in the last couple of years, and one of the things I like is being able to copy and paste parts of the automation and then move them around into the right order. But I did always find it strange that you had to press the menu with the 3 dots and then click the reorder button to move things around. I would also have often forgotten to exit out of reorder mode once I'd finished, well now the option is always available for you to move your items around, and it even works with nested blocks such as if-then actions or multiple conditions. I have found that dragging and dropping into nested sections takes a bit of getting used to for where you need to move the item to for it to work correctly, but it's definitely easier than pasting or recreating your actions. I used to have a lot of my automations in Node-RED, but setting up new Home Assistant automations from a mobile device just makes things so easy now, and so I usually create Home Assistant automations instead, unless it's a really complex automation. If you have a Zigbee network and you are using ZHA, then perhaps like me you haven't updated the firmware on your dongle since you bought it. For one of my dongles I did actually give it a go through a very convoluted process to try and upgrade it, and by the end of things I wasn't even sure if it had worked or not. Well, thankfully you can update your dongle from within Home Assistant, and the support for this has improved over the last year. And for this release they have added the ability to also update your Zigbee devices as well, where it's supported by your provider. In my case, I mainly have Aqara devices, which I don't think are supported, but I'll leave a link in the description to the ZHA documentation and the Sonoff documentation if you have a Sonoff dongle. The next one is one I hadn't thought about, but when an integration fails, it didn't used to create a repair issue. You would have to spot that the integration had failed to load in the integrations page. The repair issue functionality was developed exactly for this sort of thing, so now if an integration fails, then it will show up as a repair issue. And if it's something like an authentication issue, you should be able to click into it and update the details to get it up and running again. If you want to test out adding some interesting functionality to Home Assistant, then I recommend checking out this video on Spook Toolbox. And whilst I'm on that topic, there is a noteworthy change which has similar functionality to a piece of Spook functionality. If you create a helper to change a switch entity to a different type of entity, then you can now invert its state, which can be useful for entities which report their on-off state the wrong way around. For some reason you can only do this for cover, lock and valve entities. I'm really not sure why they didn't extend this to light entities as well. The Spook functionality allows you to invert any switch or binary sensor, so I think that this functionality and the Spook helper both have their uses really. For those of you who like analysing historic usage of your devices, you can now download that usage from within Home Assistant into a CSV file. You just need to go to the history page, not the logbook page, and in the top right you'll see an arrow icon which is the download button. You just need to select the date range and then the devices or entities that you want the data for. I think it's really nice that you can download the data for multiple entities into one file. For those of you who are already starting to build up a Matter ecosystem within Home Assistant, this release includes some diagnostic information about your Matter devices. Matter is still very new, and so I suspect this information will be as useful for developers as it will for end users who have an issue with a Matter device. I haven't explored Matter much so far myself, mainly because I have a lot of Zigbee devices, but also partly because my Home Assistant instance is on a different VLAN to my IoT devices. And as far as I know, Matter over Wi-Fi doesn't work across different networks, even with an MDNS reflector enabled. Or maybe it could just be due to needing some IPv6 firewall rules. Let me know in the comments if you think differently. They have also added the ability to ping and re-interview a Matter device, which should be helpful for troubleshooting and getting your device working again. I only have a SwitchBot Matter bridge connected to the beta version of Home Assistant, which doesn't seem to show this additional information. Next one I can't show you because I haven't gotten around to creating a Home Assistant voice assistant yet, but basically there's now a new screen where you can see and manage all of your assistants. As you can see here, the screen is blank for me. In the next month or two I will be digging into this area a lot more, so stay tuned for various content on voice assistants. And whilst we're talking about voice assistants, Assist has received 2 updates for this release. The first one is a quality of life change, which improves the errors returned from Assist when it doesn't know what to do with your question. For example, if you ask it to turn a light on in an area which doesn't exist, then it will tell you what it thinks is wrong, rather than just saying that it doesn't understand. And the second addition is really helpful. There is now an action available to use in automations which allows you to provide custom responses to custom questions that you ask Assist. So for example, you could ask it to tell you something about your smart home and get it to respond with a specific phrase. It also allows you to use templating, which means your response could be quite complex and include things such as temperature around your home or any other information from your Home Assistant entities. The next change is more of an architectural one, I believe, and to us mere mortals we won't really see many differences. The way icons are managed in Home Assistant has been changed, and there's 2 areas where you will see the differences though. One of these is the icons against some actions, so for example for the media player, and then the other one is for areas. You can now add icons to areas. Previously you could add pictures to areas, but now you can add icons as well. As you can see here, the icons on the old version are all the same for the media player, whereas for the new version they're different. The next one I thought worth a mention is the Tuya integration changes. I did add the Tuya integration once for a smart plug, but I remember going through a complex process to get it added to Home Assistant, and ultimately I stopped using the plug. Whatever that process was, this has now apparently been made simpler, with just needing to scan a QR code in the Smart Life app. I believe this version of the integration still involves the cloud though, which is why I ultimately stopped using it. Let me know in the comments if you use the Tuya integration and if you're happy with the changes made for this release. According to the documentation, apparently 20% of people that use Home Assistant use the Tuya integration, so it's certainly very popular. Another noteworthy change is that the Ecovacs integration now supports a lot more Deebot vacuums and has more entities available for your automations as well. So if you have a Deebot vacuum, then certainly check this one out. Have you ever looked in your profile section of Home Assistant and seen the massive list of refresh tokens? Well, now stale tokens get removed after 90 days of inactivity, which should hopefully keep that list a lot smaller. I used to go through the list and tidy some of them up, but clearly I gave up on that a long time ago, as I've got some tokens in my list that are showing as 5 years old. There are around 20 new integrations for this release, so I'm certainly not going to go through all of them, but here are a few that caught my eye. Air quality sensors seem to have become more popular lately, and so for this release we have one for Epion and one for Rabbit Air. Another company which seems to have received a lot of attention in the last year or so is Govee, who does various smart lighting products. This release introduces a locally controlled integration for over 50 different models of their lights, so I think a lot of people will be excited about this. A couple of releases ago, a Tesla integration through a company called Tessie was introduced, which gave access to a lot of different car sensors. For this release, there's another new one called Telemetry, which focuses on getting live telemetry data from your vehicle. Looking at the website, it seems to be in its early stages, and I'm not totally sure what it does. I think it might just act as a middleman between Home Assistant and the official Tesla API. There have been 6 integrations moved from being set up via YAML to via the UI for this release, including the proximity integration. It's also worth noting that the proximity integration has also been deprecated, and so will be removed in 2024.8. I use this integration to tell me how far away we are from different zones, so I'll need to have a read of the documentation to see how we're supposed to calculate this going forwards, because it's not immediately obvious to me from reading the release notes. Another quick thing to mention is that Python has been upgraded to version 3.12 for this release. If you are running a recommended Home Assistant install method, then the only difference that you should notice is that Home Assistant might be a little faster. If you are running a more complex install method, then there might be some work for you to do for this release. There are also quite a few backward-incompatible changes for this release, so I'm not going to go through all of these either, but a couple to mention are that if you use Lutron devices, then fan entities entities will now be created as actual fan entities rather than as lights. And there's a couple of robot vacuum integrations which were still using the vacuum.turnon instead of vacuum.start. So if your vacuum stopped working after this release, then it could be that you're using this old command instead, and so you'll need to change it. For the TP-Link integration, the polling frequency has been changed to every 60 seconds. It specifically says power strips, but I suspect it's for every type of TP-Link smart plug. Years ago, I used to use TP-Link plugs for Home Assistant, but it seemed that I would get intermittent broadcast traffic storms, which would take the network down for a minute or two. And so I never got to the bottom of the issue, and so I just stopped using the plugs, and now I only use one of these in my network. And the other one I wanted to mention is Webhooks. Until last year, webhooks used to be accessible from anywhere on the internet, until they added the ability to make them local only or accessible externally. In this release, all webhooks default to local only, so if you have any webhooks used externally, then make sure that you go into your automation trigger and you uncheck the local box if you haven't done so already. And finally, there are 3 integrations being removed due to access being removed from their APIs. One of these is the Life 360 integration, which was a good integration for tracking location. But for the past few years, using the Home Assistant companion app is my recommended way of using location tracking instead. Alright, well I think I've fired enough information at you for one video, so as always, I'll leave a link to the release notes in the description so that you can have a look through them and see if there are any new or updated integrations that might be of interest to you. Well, that's it for today, so please consider subscribing if you haven't already, liking the video if you enjoyed it, and thanks until next time.